What's good, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So today I want to talk about how you should stop wasting film, but also how you can get the most out of film. There's a couple things going on right now that are kind of bothering everybody. One is the price of film keeps going up. Also, a lot of film tends to be more scarcely available. So it's getting a bit frustrating, and I totally understand that. But I think there's a few things you can do to maximize the use of the film that you do own. That way, you can still shoot a lot, but also spend potentially less money per individual photo that you create. So there's a couple things you can do. First and foremost, I think this is a very obvious one that a lot of people don't think about, but you can use different formats of cameras in order to squeeze out more shots out of your film. So for 120 film, for example, you can use something like this. This is the Bronica ETRS, which is a 645 camera. It doesn't have a film back right now, which is why it looks a little strange. But the point is, with this camera, you get 15 shots on a roll of medium format, 120 film. 645 is probably the most you're gonna get. But even 6x6, a lot of people probably don't shoot 6x6 because they prefer to shoot 6x7 or even 6x9. And I think 6x9 is basically a waste of film in my opinion. And 6x7, and I use the Pentax 6.7, but I use it because I love that camera and how it operates. Not so much because I'm obsessed with the size of the negative. So I think everyone should think about this. Do you need to be shooting those larger formats? Is it like some weird obsession with size? These things aren't that important because ultimately with medium format, your negatives are all gonna be big, whether 6.45 or they're 6.9. Obviously 6.45 is a big difference from 6.9, but are you gonna see that big difference? Is it actually gonna make that big a difference for your workflow? I don't know. I feel like for a lot of people, it probably doesn't. So I urge you to look at some of those 6.45 cameras. This is an SLR style camera, but there's also other cameras that are rangefinder cameras, like the Fuji cameras, for example. People love those and they're automatic. They've got a lot of cool kind of electronic features that might make your shooting experience even better. So you should probably check those things out. But shooting more images, I think, is more important than having a bigger negative, especially when you're talking in the medium format world. In the 35 millimeter world, all 35 millimeters is basically the same no matter what you do, unless you have a Nexpan, which obviously is 2 shots, which gets you less shots. But that's a look, and that's a different kind of style of image. So I understand that. But you can shoot half frame, which is basically a camera that, like the Olympus Pen, I believe, is one of the famous ones. That just breaks up your 35 millimeter shot into 2. So you end up getting 70 plus images on your roll. And that's massively amount. I've never used them myself, so I can't vouch for kind of the experience or ultimately the image quality, given that the negatives do get pretty small there. But, it's something to consider. And it might be right for certain occasions. You don't always have to do this. You don't have to replace all of your 35 millimeter cameras. But if you're going on a trip, for example, something very casual, something very chill, or you just want to kind of mess around and shoot some stuff with friends at a party, that could be a very good use of half frame. So I'm going to explore this myself. I have to get my hands on a half frame camera first. And I'm very curious to see what I'm going to think about, the images themselves and the scans and that kind of stuff. All right, the second one is actually one of my favorite ones, the second tip. And that's basically you should load your film in the dark. For 120, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant, so don't even consider it for that. But for 35 millimeter, you have your film leader at the beginning of the roll of film. That you can actually use that. That's film that works and it's sensitized. Of course, the edge that's already sticking out, that particular edge has already been exposed to light, so it's no good. But everything else that's inside that canister has emulsion on it. And it's theoretically a big waste when you load your film in the daylight and pull that leader out. All of that is getting exposed and you can't use it. If you load your film in the dark in an older camera, kind of like this Canon 7, for example, you can actually, use every single, area of that particular film. Loading in the dark could be easy, especially if you know your camera very well. Like this one's not very difficult. But even something like a Leica, for example, like those, the M6, where you have that cool thing where you remove the bottom, you just shove the film in there, pull it a little bit. There's no reason I see why you couldn't do that. And I don't own a Leica, so don't quote me on that. But the point is, with a lot of manual cameras, especially like this one that I have here, if you do that in complete darkness or in a dark bag, you will be able to use those shots. And I do that a lot. Obviously, you can't always do that, especially if you're out on the road. But if you're at home and you're going to go out and use your camera and take some photos, why not load it in the dark? It'll save you, those 3-4 shots on your roll of film. You can get maybe 41 shots total out of your roll as opposed to the 36 that you typically get. So I definitely recommend that. You can't do it with every camera, obviously. If you have an automatic camera like this one, for example, it's already programmed to buzz through and pull out a bunch of the leader, and you can't really do anything too much about that. But if you shoot a lot of old cameras like this, which I know a lot of you do, go ahead and do it. You're leaving shots on the table. The next point is actually a pretty interesting one. I find that when I shoot photos. Sometimes I'll get through half a roll and my experience of shooting for that day is kind of done, right? I'm very impulsive and I'm very impatient, so I want to see my photos right away, but at the same time, it's like, well, I have this whole other half a roll left. So what do? Well, I actually do this often where in the dark again, or in a dark bag, I open my camera, and again, this works on specific cameras. Definitely does not work on 120, but on 35 millimeter, I open the camera in the dark. Pretend we're in the dark right now. Open the camera like this, boom. And then once it's open, your film's gonna be loaded in here and you're gonna be on the most recent shot right here. What you can do is actually pull the roll of film out from this side where it's actually, being held by the camera, and just cut it with a scissor. And what that does is two things. One, it preserves the roll of film that is unexposed, that's still in the actual canister or in the cartridge, let's say the cassette. So, now you have a roll of film that is good for later. And then what you have left on this side that's wound onto the camera is all of your exposed shots. So those you can actually then develop and then you have your shots. This doesn't work for everybody. If you send your film to the lab, for example, to get developed, you might not be able to do this. But if you do it at home, you can 100% do this. The other thing you can do is the same thing that I just explained, but instead of cutting your film out, is you actually wind it all the way back into the camera, but you have to note the number that you were on. So let's say you did 15 shots, just remember it's 15 shots. You then take that same exact roll of film, remember uncut, just completely wound back in. You can put it in another camera for a different experience. And then at that point, you go ahead and you can, as long as you cover the lens like this, you can blast off your 15 exposures and you won't affect the images you already took. And then now you're on the 16th one and you can progress from there on your other camera. You might be curious, like, how does this save you film? Well, I think a lot of people end up wasting film shots because they want to finish a roll. You either take a bunch of selfies or you take a bunch of photos that you don't really want to take just because you're like, well, I have 8 shots left, but I want to develop this roll, so I'm just going to take photos or whatever. Now you don't have to do that. Those 8 shots, you can preserve them and use them later for something else. I actually have a ton of like half rolls of film that are kind of lying around. And, I always mark them. I put notes on the actual roll. That way you know that you did this. Because if you don't put notes, then, you might forget and then you have no idea what to do. But as long as you take notes, you can do this. And I think it's a good way for you to experience your film on multiple cameras, on multiple days, while still getting the benefit of your images as quickly as you can. Because if you don't do that otherwise, then you're just going to be there kind of taking photos for the sake of it. And that's a bit of a waste. I'm not against people just kind of having fun and doing whatever they want. But in that case, like, you're just doing it because you really want to see your images. So why not, save that roll? So doing that in the darkroom, that can help you a lot. And I do that quite a bit. All right, the next thing you can do to get the most out of film photography is actually buy specialty rolls. I've got one really good example here, and that's Kodak XX. XX is something that's sold as full length for motion picture, but a lot of people buy the full kind of rolls, the big ones on the reels, and then they cut them down to 35 millimeter cassettes and then sell them to you. And this is great because the film is actually much cheaper this way, given that A, you're buying from the big bulk roll, and then B, these are not sold directly from Kodak, the retailer, in 35 cassettes. And therefore, you're paying a little bit for the person doing the work, but it's still going to be cheaper than shooting a lot of other film that you can buy directly from Kodak or from your typical retailers. I find that on eBay, for example, a roll of XX is like anywhere from like 4.5 to like 6 pounds, potentially dollars. And again, don't quote me on any of these prices, it's things I remember, but it's a pretty good deal. So I urge you to go out there and actually look for that yourself and see what you can do. The other thing you can do is actually bulk roll yourself. I've never done it, but I know a lot of people do. And with that, you save a bunch of money because you're buying big reels of film, and per kind of distance, let's say a typical roll of 35 millimeter is 6 feet. Per 6 feet, you get so much better of a price if you do it yourself. And that's like the second time I knocked this. But ultimately, you save money because you're spending less for the same amount of film if you were to compare and contrast. So bulk rolls are great, but also if someone else is bulk rolling, that can also be very great. All right, and the last tip I have for you in order to kind of maximize the use of your film or a film in general is actually buying expired film. I made a video about it, you can check it out here. But expired film is obviously a bit of a gamble. You don't really know what you're gonna get. But I think there's a couple ways you can buy expired film and be kind of safer about it. The most obvious thing you can do is, buy from someone you trust. And theoretically, that someone may have tested some of these rolls already to ensure that they're all good. The other thing you can do is actually buy lower ISO film. That stuff tends to not kind of hurt over the long run as much as higher ISO films. Things in the 50, 100 range tend to keep their, characteristics pretty well intact regardless of, 10, 20 years. And also regardless of storage potentially. So, that's a good way to mitigate some of the risks. But shooting expired film is great because if you don't shoot it, that film theoretically is just going to keep sitting there and it might even go to waste. It might be thrown out eventually. And that is a massive waste. Obviously, there's a lot of plastic that's being used to create that film, so that sucks. But then also, it's film and someone should have used it. So if you buy expired film, it's a good way to kind of potentially buy film cheaper, although it's not always cheaper, which is kind of weird to me. But it's also a good way for you to make use of film that already exists, that is just sitting there and waiting for somebody to use it. Expired film could be a lot of fun too, depending on what you get. So those are a couple kind of tips and tricks I think that could help a lot of you. Let me know in the comments, is there any particular one of these that you feel pretty strongly about, in a good way or in a bad way? Do you think some of these things are just not worth it? Also, is there anything I missed, anything you think that everybody should know about? Let me know in the comments. All right, y'all, that's the video for today. If you enjoyed it, of course, like the video. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe. Why are you waiting? All right, y'all, to the next one. I'm out.